All right, we're here again with Kevin Doak of Georgetown University to talk to us a little bit about the assassination of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Professor Doak, welcome.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. It's really nice to be back here again with you and with your viewers.
So what I want to start off with was on a totally subjective level. When I saw the headlines regarding the assassination of former Prime Minister Abe, I was very surprised at the seeming mundanity of the event. It was almost as if they were reporting on something kind of routine, and it just struck me as very weird. You know, there's an assassination of a major international figure. Why weren't more people's hair on fire? It seemed relatively common. I'm talking about U.S. headlines there, so maybe there's a different perspective elsewhere. But what was your read there?
Well, let me start off by, there's something I have to say. This is not only a political disaster, it's very personal to me because I met Prime Minister Abe. We had a personal one-on-one meeting in his office in 2013. He cited my work, I cited his work. So when I heard that he was shot, I first hoped that this wasn't going to be fatal. And then when I was able to confirm that he'd been assassinated, I was really myself in shock. I think I experienced in many ways what many Japanese did. It was total horrific, hard to imagine, hard to understand, shocking, angering. I went through the whole process. And then, as you suggested, I think, when I saw how the American media was treating him, I thought, do they never pay attention to Japan? Is it all about China? I mean, don't they understand how significant this man was? And I would say, and I have said even before his assassination, I believe Shinzo Abe was now this is going to really come across strong, your viewers, the most significant politician of the 21st and maybe 20th century, certainly the 21st century. And the reason for that is multiple. First of all, Japan is the second largest free economy in the world. We can debate China, but it's not a free economy. So it's a very important country. And Abe was doing something to reconfigure it in ways that I think were very much in America's national interest. And he was truly a political genius in the sense that he knew how far he could push without going too far. And he knew when to push and not to become complacent. He knew exactly how to manage Japan, a very difficult place to manage politically. And that's why he was the longest serving prime minister in modern Japanese history. All right, he served from 2006-07, then he had a health issue, and he stepped down, and then he came back and served from 2012 to 2020, making him the longest serving prime minister in Japanese history. And they've just announced, I'm getting to your question, but it's some background. They just announced that they're going to hold a state funeral for him in September 27th, I believe, making it only the second state funeral for a prime minister ever held. And the other one was for Yoshida Shigeru, I believe it was around 1967. And until Abe came in, Yoshida was the longest serving Japanese prime minister. So he's even surpassed the most consequential politician before him, which was Yoshida Shigeru. Extremely important man. And the American media were kind of like, oh yeah, somebody was shot in Japan. And then I read another coverage story that went through all the different assassinations of people in all kinds of countries that you've never heard of. This is just, it's really hard for me to just take. But Americans tend to downplay Japan and they don't really see the significance. And it is what it is.
What do you attribute that to?
Well, I think I have a theory that Americans and Western people in general can only focus on one Asian country at a time. In the 1980s, it was all Japan and we completely forgot about China. And then today it's China and we forget completely about Japan and oftentimes even Korea and some other Asian countries. One at a time. When the nuclear issue ramps up, we start looking at North Korea. We forget about China for a minute. We've completely forgotten about Japan. Part of it is this truly Orientalist attitude that only sees Asia as a utilitarian place to either make a lot of money from or win some kind of military contracts from. We just don't take Asia seriously. And because of that, we don't recognize the significance of Japan. That's my sense.
And do you think I guess being distracted with Russia as well is a wider part of that single mind focus?
Yes. I mean, there's all kinds of causes. Yes, Russia right now, big problem. Ukraine, our tensions focused over there. But then there's the people who only think about domestic issues. And here it's all about all the murders in the cities, but only certain murders, right? It's not the number of people who are killed in Chicago and New York every weekend. It's these kind of media-oriented mass shootings that the media likes to talk about. Now, when we're talking about all these mass shootings, I mean, Uvalde was in the news, this one in New York was in the news, all kinds of them. The shooting of one person doesn't seem to measure much, does it? Especially if you don't care about the country and don't know about his significance. One person getting shot doesn't make it in the American news. So I guess we should be grateful. I don't know if grateful is the right word. Grateful that the American media even reported the story, but it is really bizarre. And I think it speaks to how inured we've become with violence in America.
Ideally, given your understanding of the significance of Japan and the amount that we should be paying attention to it, what should the American coverage of Abe's assassination have said?
Well, I have seen some American politicians, ranging from Secretary of State Blinken to former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and they kind of all agreed in talking about Abe, and it's an assessment I would share too. He was an amazing man. He was a gentleman. He was a kind man. He was a man with a great sense of humor. He was a true genius of the 21st century, maybe even the 20th century. This was a guy who really we should pay attention to if we want to understand how to bring our country together. Abe brought his country together better than any other Japanese politician. Now, the left in Japan still likes to call him divisive. That's their favorite adjective. They're protesting having a state funeral for him, a state funeral for the man who's the longest serving prime minister, because they think it could be divisive. And get this, they filed a lawsuit alleging that having a state funeral for him in a secular building with no religious activities would be a violation of religious conscience. That lawsuit's going to get tossed. But that tells you something, that with such a divisive country that Japan is, he was able to unify it to become the longest serving prime minister. And in politics, he has his enemies, but he really can show us how efficiency, effectiveness, intelligence, compassion, a good sense of humor, and a great globalist view of foreign policy and the nation's future and its past can really bring people together. He was extraordinary in doing that. So we should learn from him.
So I was planning to sort of start out by asking a little bit about the assassination, but you've shared quite a bit there now on the context that I have questions about. So tell me a little bit more about what makes you give him this assessment of A, a great unifier, and B, more boldly, one of the greatest statesmen of the last century.
Well, the argument that he's a great unifier, in spite of the arguments against him as divisive, is simply the fact of his longevity. You know, Japanese prime ministers, unlike American presidents, they don't get elected and get to sit there for 4 years and rot and become decrepit. You can't get rid of them. They can call in a snap election immediately and toss them out, as happened to Boris Johnson, who's in a similar parliamentary system. So the fact in such a, what do we want to call it, sensitive parliamentary structure, he was able to stay in office so long, tells us that he could unify Japan better than anybody else. And even his opponents. I have a friend, University of Tokyo professor, wrote a book on why people keep electing Abe. He's anti-Abe. And he said, well, the reason they keep electing Abe is not that they like Abe, it's because there's nobody better. And I think, well, that's a good argument. I mean, he unifies Japan better than the alternatives. He did a lot of things with womenomics. Even the term Abenomics was named for him. And it was a very interesting three-pronged effort to get Japan's economy back on track. I think most fair observers said that he did a better job of restoring Japan's economy than anybody else had. So in Abenomics, what he's done with security, I think, is extremely important in global politics. He envisioned, it was his vision, and put into place what's called now the Quad. And I'm not talking about these four nutcases that we have in our Congress that go by that name. The Quad, of course, refers to India, Australia, Japan, and the United States, forming a coalition of liberal democracies to try to buttress the culture of liberal democracy in the Asia-Pacific region. This was Abe's idea. And Abe made sure it got implemented. And he really deserves a lot of credit for that vision. He was one of the very first world leaders to recognize a serious threat coming from communist China and still try to engage with communist China. Part of his brilliance as a politician was how he knew the need to get close and to work with even opponents and enemies to the degree possible. So he worked with China. He worked with Korea, even when Korea was causing problems for Japan. And he even befriended Putin, right? It's really remarkable because Russia's claimed Japanese territory, they won't return it. So a lesser politician would just be resentful and angry, but he invited Putin to his hometown. They took baths together. He really knows how to put the personal touch on people, even whom he may not like, but who are vital to the national interest. He was a great politician. Nobody liked him.
Tell me a little bit about, you went through a lot of the foreign policy relationships there. Talk to me a little bit about, for example, Japan's interests, Japan's relationship relative. China, I know a bit more about, but let's say Russia and India. Let's start there. What were the interests? What were the discussions involved in those relationships?
Right. Let's start with India because that was the key player in the Quad to bring India in. And one of the things Japan could do that certainly America and England were less able to do was to treat India as an equal, not a former colonial power, right? And also, Japan is a predominantly non-Christian country. India is a predominantly non-Christian country. And what Abe could say was that democracy is not necessarily a Christian value. It's a universal human value. And what he was really trying to do with India was say, here is the largest, in terms of population, democracy in the world, India. And here is the second largest economic democracy in the world, Japan. And we want to bring in the largest democratic economy, America, and we want to tie it in with Australia, another democratic important economy, and try to ensure a globalist value of democracy for the region. Very important. And now some people said, well, this was a way of trying to curtail or cordon off China. And that's not entirely false, but that's not also what it was really about. It was also about pointing to common traits of democracy that cross religion and cultures. And it took Abe's vision, I think, to implement that. Russia, and most of his relationship with Russia was before the Ukrainian War. After the Ukrainian War, Japan's attitude towards Russia has hardened, much more than China's. In fact, I just read a newspaper that Putin will not be invited to Abe's state funeral. And this is kind of a big blow because I think Putin thought he was a good friend of Abe's. But Russia was, I'm not sure how much energy Japan got from Russia. I don't think it did, because most of it from the Mideast. But it was really about these northern territories that since World War II, Russia has taken and Japan has never given up its claim on. And that is an ongoing problem. So it's a very sensitive issue. And Abe really tried to lower the temperature, develop a personal relationship, and see if progress couldn't be made on that and other issues as well.
That's the Senkaku Islands, or do I have the name?
No,
wrong?
Senkaku is in the south. That's with China. These are the northern territories. The Kuril Islands are often called. Shikotan, Habomai, I can't remember all the names. Up north of Hokkaido, which is its northernmost territory.
My understanding is that I guess back in the 80s there was a bit of a trade war between the U.S. and Japan. To what degree does that sort of dynamic still exist today? What does it look like, and how did Abe relate to the U.S.?
Right. The trade war from the 80s has been long over, right? Japan went into the 1990s, and some people call that a kind of lost decade of economic growth. But when Abe comes to office for the first time in 2006, the 90s are already over, and Japan is now back on track and trying to build a global economy. I think the most important thing that Abe did in terms of trade and economics was his imagining of a policy called Abenomics, that involved a whole host of technical things that I'm not an economist, I can't really get into, but it had to do with, spending policies, tightening up, loosening up available credits. Anyway, the three arrows of Abenomics is what everyone talked about. They were fairly effective, but it was also a reaching out to the United States on all sorts of issues, no longer merely economic. And I think this is, again, one of the problems that America has with understanding Asia. We think of China too much in terms of economics and not enough in terms of military until very recently, right? When we realized that they're using economics for military purposes. Japan's problem since the post-war, and this was critical for Abe and his legacy, was this notion that Yoshida, the man I just talked about, who was the longest prime minister before him, Prime Minister Yoshida set up that said, basically Japan is going to be an economic, powerful country that has no military. Can't violate the Constitution, even though the American Pentagon was pushing Japan by the 1950s, the Korean War, to rearm. Yoshida was saying, no, you guys were right. We hate war. We hate nukes. We're just going to be a peaceful country that makes a lot of money off of it. And that was the structure of what's called the post-war regime. one of Abe's signature expressions was Japan needs to escape from the post-war regime. And what he meant by that was, and he used this term as well, Japan needs to become a normal nation. Japan should not be seen, as a certain European diplomat once called it, a nation of transistor salesmen, or a nation of just basically economic animals, another term used against it. Japan needs to become what it is, which is a normal nation of normal people who are very democratic, and that means it needs to be responsible for its own self-defense. And that's what made him controversial, because there are still leftists in Japan who really want Japan to remain pacifist so that China's growing military power will dominate. And there's even some people like that in America who, whether they wanted China to dominate, they wanted America to dominate. They didn't want Japan to become another independent military power source. Abe understood that Japan's military power would work hand in glove with America's. And in fact, he passed a bill, I think it was around 2015, to make sure that Japan's strengthening of its military would be tied into mutual agreements with the United States. So we needed to see Japan more in terms of a military partner. And I think there are people in America who want to do that, particularly in the Pentagon. But the Japanese people have been very reluctant to revise their constitution to put themselves in a position to become a really active equal partner. Abe was the single hope in Japan for making that happen. And in the last election that was held just the day, I guess, after he was assassinated, his party, but also more importantly, other parties that also maybe even more strongly want to revise the Constitution, won a sweeping victory. And now the word is that the Japanese parliament is posed to revise Article 9 and to, for the first time since the post-war period, become a normal nation in which the military is seen as a legal structure completely consistent with the Constitution.
Okay, so this takes us a little bit into Japan's internal dynamics. We touched a little bit on Abe's legacy on the diplomatic scene. Fill in the context for me a little more. What are the, you mentioned Japan's left, you mentioned the people who want to rearm versus the people who don't want to rearm. Fill that entire debate out for me, as well as its wider context and some of the other discussions at play.
Okay, let me try and divide it into three groups, very arbitrarily. But keep in mind, Japan has a very small Communist Party and a very small Socialist Party, which we don't in America. So you do have hard left people in the political world. They've been joined by leftist pacifists, and sadly, many of these are Christians, including the Japanese Catholic Bishops' Conference, which doesn't like Abe at all, never did. And they want to cling to this pacifist structure of Japan. They want to, in fact, weaken Japan militarily. And the left, clearly the communists and the socialists, would have very little objection if that opened up a vacuum that China could fill, because they kind of share the same political values as China. The Christians are just much more naive, and I think they feel that any kind of war is horrible, kind of like Pope Francis says, no just war anymore. And therefore, Japan should simply rely on the goodness of the international community and God's providence in terms of its security. In the meantime, they should go about making a lot of money and being nice and loving people through economic trade, I guess. I'm not sure. So that's one group. The other extreme side, not extreme side, but the other opposite side would be Abe and his supporters. And what's really interesting is Abe was the first prime minister born in the post-war period, no connection with wartime. And his supporters are generally of the same generation, right? People basically under 60 years old. They're post-war Japanese. They were completely raised in this democratic and cosmopolitan culture. And they've been supporting Abe because they're saying, they're feeling rather ashamed that the rest of the world thinks that the Japanese aren't trustworthy, that somehow North Korea can have nukes, Iran can have nukes, China can have nukes, but the Japanese aren't trustworthy with nukes. And like, this is not fair, this is not right, this is an affront to our dignity. We simply want to be full participants in the international coalition of democratic countries, including military. And that's where Abe's supporters were, and that's where they're coming from. In the middle, and some of these people are also in Abe's party, are people who aren't really on the left, but they also don't want to have the military because they think economically that's just a bad idea. That as long as America will continue to pay for Japan's defense, they're kind of like Germany has been up until recently, West Germany now. As long as America will keep paying for our defense and we keep making money off of it, What's the problem? We don't actually want to put on boots and a helmet and go train in the mud anyway, and carry a gun. We'd rather go to our offices and play with our computers and make a lot of money and go out to nice restaurants. So those are the kind of three streams that Abe had to negotiate. And he clearly wasn't going to negotiate with the left, but he did a great job of embarrassing them, of pointing out to them that if they got their way, China would run Japan. Do you really want to lose your freedoms? And a lot of people, they don't want to, but at least it kind of put him off center. He did a good job of bringing some of the people in the middle over to his side, long enough to keep this thing going. And now the question is whether or not his vision will be implemented by the current prime minister, who has said, Prime Minister Kishida, that he will enact Abe's dream of revising the constitution so that Japan's military will be recognized as constitutionally legal. We'll wait and see. We don't know.
So is this question of rearmament kind of the biggest and most central in Japanese politics?
I think so. It usually goes by constitutional revision. And there are other things people want to revise, but they're all become rather dispersed and marginal. The real question is the so-called Article 9, which says Japan cannot maintain war potential. Well, they do. And so it's not so much Japan wants to rearm as it wants to legitimize legally under the Constitution what it already has before the Japanese people become even more cynical about the rule of law and say, law is just a tool. Obviously, we don't need to pay attention to it because we have a military and the law says we shouldn't, so screw the law. And obviously, that's not healthy. What he really wants is a democratic rule of law culture to be enhanced in Japan. And there's a lot of people in Japan who really don't care about that. They've become already very cynical about law and about democracy and about those kinds of values. They just want to be consumers.
What drives the Japanese left, the communist and socialist bloc, if Japan seems to be so, at least from my point of view, well off at even at all socioeconomic levels?
Right. Well, first of all, they're very small. There are very few of them. But I think what drives them is that they're actually very educated and they've got a very good point. And they go right at the weakness of the old LDP, the Yoshida LDP, which was that you can have human dignity and just be a transistor salesman. And the left are saying, capitalism doesn't give you dignity. Making money is not a high enough goal. We want justice, freedom, and peace. And somehow they see that coming out of Russia and China. And that's what makes them leftists. But at least their rhetoric, they don't like to talk too much about China and Russia. In fact, they sometimes try to back away. The Communist Party will say, well, we're not in favor of China. China's a terrible place. They don't have freedoms like we do. But basically, they share all the Chinese communist values. They're a communist party. And I think what they're really trying to say is, isn't there some way we can talk about the human person, not as having a soul, but as having a dignity that goes beyond capitalism? Capitalism deprives you of your human dignity. So that resonates with some people.
Would you call it a sort of romantic vision of, is this all there is, this sort of materialistic, comfortable bourgeois existence, or is that not quite it?
Are you talking about the left or about Japanese in general?
The left, yeah. Is it a sort of romantic vision that the sort of materialistic, comfortable capitalist consumer culture is sort of leaves you high and dry?
Yeah, it's both romantic and realistic, though, because in Japan, that's the dominant view, is that materialism and consumerism is enough. And Japan is a very pleasant place, and it's very easy to get sucked into that. Consumerism, uber alles, as it were. And the Communist Party is one of the few that's resisted that. And so for some people, particularly academics and overeducated people, they're saying, hey, maybe there's something more, something better. And the communists offer it to us. And until Abe came along, nobody was trying to shatter the post-war consensus on consumerism and economics as Japan's primary business. Only the communists were. The communists aren't really a big threat. There's so few of them, but their pacifism, which was designed to work with China ever since the end of World War II, that pacifism appeals to a lot of misguided people, liberals, and particularly the few Christians. Japan doesn't have a large Christian population, but many of them also are like, yeah, why can't we all just be nice and get along? And there's your romanticism, I suppose.
So does you said the Catholic bishops, for example, and the Christian approach, is it tied to that sort of vision that consumerism isn't enough, that there has to be some higher purpose to human life?
Yeah, I think that's the overlapping with the Communist Party and the Japanese Catholic Bishops' Conference, which is really strange. Now, I say the Catholic Bishops' Conference because most Japanese Catholics do not agree with their bishops' leadership. They know they're leftists. And recently they've become a little less than they were a few years ago. But during Abe's term, because that's my focus here, during Abe's term, the Japanese Catholic Bishops' Conference issued a whole host of very politicized, very anti-Abe statements about, well, if he goes to Yasukuni, we're losing religious freedom. If Abe gets his way, we're going to have a war. And all this is just garbage. It's not true. And most people in Japan don't buy it. And I think that's hurt the credibility of the Bishops' Conference and exposed them for the leftists they were. As I say, they're starting to get a little bit better. Abe's no longer been seen. The new leadership isn't quite as extreme, but they've always been kind of left-leaning.
Is there a degree to which Abe could also be seen as having maybe a more, I don't want to impose Western terms, but a more right romantic, in the sense of sort of restoring some of Japan's sense of itself historically?
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word romantic with him, only because he strikes me as the most practical and the most realistic politician I ever saw. As I said earlier, he knew exactly how far to go and how far not to go. He's not an idealist or a romantic in that sense. What Abe was saying about history, and he backed away rather quickly. He was very upset. History issues are big in Asia. They're big in Korea. They're big in China. And he started saying, you know, what people are saying about our history is not right. And we should be proud of our history. And then it became even more political. And he finally, I think, came to the right conclusion, which was, let the historians deal with history. I've got my hands full of politics. Let the historians battle the history issues. But his basic point was that you shouldn't, particularly in the normal schools, or maybe I should say in the compulsory education schools, elementary middle school, the curriculum should not be based on how horrible our country is. And we're seeing some of this in our country right now, too. You can get to university and start talking more critically about these things, and you need to. But what he was really pushing back against was people who said Japan was a terrible, terrible country. The people can't be trusted. All they do is rape and pillage and commit war crimes. They've done nothing good. And he's like, wait a minute, you really want your kids to grow up and think about their grandparents that way? You know, there's maybe more to say about this. But these issues became very controversial and wrapped up in all kinds of difficulties, and there still are. That's not just Abe's problem. That issue's not going away.
What does all of this have to do with his assassination? What were the motives of the assassination? Who did it? Why did they do it?
The thing that really bothers me, as I said, I take it personally. The thing that really bothers me is that none of this had anything to do with this assassination. Americans, you know, the JFK assassination, we're always looking for a conspiracy. We're not comfortable saying an idiot just did something stupid and it didn't have any significance. It had no meaning. And I think that's the case here. So the assassin was a man, 41-year-old man named Yamagami Tetsuya, or in English, Tetsuya is his first name, Tetsuya Yamagami. And he said when they tackled him, I had no objections to Abe's political ideas. This was for something else. And then the police investigated it, and they found out that his mother had given a large sum of money to a religious organization. That's all the police would say. They wouldn't identify it. It's very strange. But since then, we've pretty much identified it. We now know that the religious organization was the Unification Church, often known as the Moonies, started by Sun Myung Moon. Well, this is really bizarre because to this day, and a lot of Abe's opponents have been trying to do some muckraking journalism and connect him to the Moonies, and they haven't done a good job of connecting him. The best they can argue is that the Moonies came to Japan when Abe's grandfather was prime minister, Kishi Nobusuke. Oh, so Kishi's responsible for bringing them to Japan. And his father, apparently, who was a foreign minister, had good things to say about Reverend Sun Myung Moon because Sun Myung Moon was an anti-communist Korean, right? As I heard from South Korea, many of these people were anti-communists, as the founder of the Unification Church was. And of course, Kishi and his son, Abe Shintaro, and even Abe Shinzo were anti-communist. But they've never linked Abe to the Unification Church, except that a few years ago, I guess, as a paid guest speaker, he went to one of the things and gave a talk. Well, so did Trump. So did many famous politicians, because the Unification Church has a lot of money, and they use that money to bring in politicians, particularly if they're conservatives and don't like communism, and just to give a kind of nice talk, and they pay them an honorarium, and that's it. I have not seen any linkage of Abe other than that he gave one talk one time at a big meeting with lots of other world politicians. The problem was one of Abe's political opponents, the leader of a very small party called the NHK Party. Now, NHK is like BBC. You know, this is like the BBC party. They're talking about TV programming, okay? His name was Kurokawa Akihiko. Just a month before the assassination, went on TV and blamed Abe's grandfather for the anti-Japanese unification church coming to Japan. And it appears that the assassin Kurokawa saw that, and he had planned to assassinate the leader of the unification church. But he saw that, and then he found that Abe was coming to his town, Nara, so he took out Abe instead. It just doesn't make any sense at all. It's crazy. That's all I can say. It just doesn't, it's not a political assassination. It's an unhinged guy who's upset about his mother losing money and donations to the Unification Church, who was misled by an opponent who thought that Abe and his family were connected to the Unification Church, decided to shoot Abe because of that.
And there wouldn't have been a better, more directly linked, high-profile target in Japan with linked to the Unification Church?
Well, there's no higher profile target in Japan than Abe Shinzo. And the assassin said that he was going to shoot the head of the Unification Church, but Abe was a convenient target. He came to his town, and because he'd heard he was connected, he was going to take his anger out on him. It's just bizarre. I think the other thing that we shouldn't ignore that has to be said, Japan has no guns. Rifles only under a very strict hunting permit system, but essentially no guns and no handguns whatsoever, no right to a handgun. So this guy went on the internet and made his own. This is something Americans might want to think about. You know? Japan has the strictest gun laws probably in the world, certainly in any democracy in the world. And so this guy went on the internet and made a gun that was able to kill the former prime minister. Where there's a will, there's a way. But my friend and colleague, Jason Morgan, who lives in Japan and knows a lot about these things, he just wrote a very interesting assessment of all this. If your readers are interested, they can find it on the American Conservatives homepage. Just a very recent one. And he makes a very interesting point in the outset. He said, what's happened to the Japanese man? Here's a 41-year-old man who has a grievance to a politician. And instead of what his ancestors would have done even a few decades ago, he refused to face him, maybe with a knife, face to face and stab him. No. He stands 10 feet behind him and shoots him in the back. What kind of a man is this? What's happened to Japanese masculinity and Japanese men? Where's the honor? Where's the valor? Where's the bravery? And now this is me, not my friend Jason, but I would add to that, the irony is Abe was trying to return Japanese men, particularly young Japanese men, to that notion of masculinity and valor. That was his mission. And this guy was not one. He was not somebody who had that. It was 3 years in the Navy self-defense force. We don't know why he left. It was a long time ago. He was not a man of much valor or bravery. And Abe was trying to change that. It's just irony upon irony.
And so there's no, there's a sense that the story is as simple as that. There's no sort of deeper context or anything like that.
A number of us immediately had our conspiracies ready to go. People saying he's got to be a Zainichi, that is to say, an ethnic Korean Japanese who don't like Abe. No, apparently it wasn't the case. China's got to be behind it. Well, one of my friends said, I know China was behind it. Well, there's two problems to that theory. One, the police have now released this guy's finances. He was in terrible shape and he didn't have any payments. He had more debts than payments, so nobody paid him to do it. But the real problem with it is if China or Russia would never have done it because Putin liked it, but if any major country had given him the access and planned with him, they would have given him a decent gun. Not a gun that misses the first shot because he made it with duct tape. So no, I think if there's any kind of connection, any deeper conspiracy, the Japanese investigation, the police will find it. They're very professional, they're very good, but they haven't released anything. And so far, everything they've released suggests that sometimes Occam's razor is the way to go. You know, the simplest solution. It's just a lunatic did something lunatic. It's horrible.
So along the lines of towards greater masculinity among Japanese men, I came across Abe's book, Utsukushi Kunie, towards a beautiful country, I guess. Maybe I'm not using the right.
Yeah, it's exactly right. My favorite book because he cites me in it.
So tell me a little bit about what's the thesis there, and what does it look like for Japan to go towards a beautiful country, in addition to a renewed sense of masculinity among the men?
Great question. So that book was published in two different forms, Atarashi Kunie and then Utsukushi Kunie. So towards a new country and then towards a beautiful country, and they're interlinked. The key part of that book, I think, is the chapter on nationalism. And because everyone says, oh, Abe, terrible nationalist, a horrible nationalist. I wish more people would read that chapter in Utsukushi Kunie, Towards a Beautiful Country, on nationalism, because he makes it very clear that his nationalism is not a racial nationalism. It's not an ethnic nationalism. He praises Brazilians who become Japanese and become national heroes on their soccer team. He praises Kathy Freeman, an Aboriginal who in the Olympics in Australia was able to carry both the Australian flag and the Aboriginal flag. He said, that's great. He's not opposed to this. He has other examples as well. It's quite clear for him, as he said, a Japanese is somebody who fights for the country. This could be athletics, sports, fights for the country under the national flag. That's all. And so he had a vision of a beautiful Japan that was cosmopolitan but patriotic. And that's what really bothered a lot of people. And that's what he was trying to do. He was trying to instill a greater sense of patriotism in a healthy, liberal, democratic way. Right?
I recently read an article on some Japanese history website, sort of trying to refute the claim that it was the Americans who made the post-war constitution, and it sort of takes you all of it and said, well, it's not really proper to say that the Americans did it for so and so reasons. So can you situate Abe's nationalism relative to that sort of pro post-war consensus view?
Yes. Yeah, that's a great one. I'm familiar with that debate too, but it's on the face of it, it doesn't stand, because when Japan's constitution was implemented, Japan didn't have sovereignty, okay? MacArthur had full sovereignty. MacArthur passed the constitution he wanted. There was some Japanese input, most of it was thrown out. So that's an interesting argument. However, to your point, Abe never said, because the Americans wrote this constitution, we should throw out the whole constitution. He said, I grew up under this constitution. I was born under this constitution. We can live with it, but we can also revise it. The American Constitution has been revised. We've amended it. He said, so we can revise the Constitution. And the problem was there wasn't a good system in place when he was prime minister to start that process of amendment of the Constitution. So he passed something called the National Referendum Law, which gave the people, the kokumi, the citizens of Japan, the power to have a referendum on whether or not they wanted the Constitution to be revised. And see, there's powerful forces in Japan that don't want the people to make that decision. And I think increasingly the people are saying, yeah, there's a lot of things we should revise about our Constitution. We're not going to throw out the Constitution. We're going to amend it. So I don't think he wants to throw out the Constitution. Most Japanese people like the Constitution, but they recognize that there are problems with it, that it was framed in a different time period for a different Japan, and it needs to be updated. So in some senses, you can call Abe more of a progressive than a romantic reactionary. He was really looking to the future. He was saying towards, right? That book title you used, Utsukushi Kuni E. The A, right, means moving towards, or an Atarashi Kuni, towards a new country. You don't want to go backwards. But he understood that the past is a kind of prelude to the future. So the past is important, but you don't want to live in the past. He's a very cosmopolitan guy.
All right, so Abe and his legacy, crystallize it for me here at the end. What should we take away?
Let me start with something Boris Johnson just said when he was stepping down as Prime Minister of England. He said, in politics, I've learned that no man is indispensable. And my thought is, that may be true for Boris Johnson. I don't know if that's true about Abe. There was nobody like him. The best that people are saying in Japan is, we have to implement his vision. We have to revise Article 9 of the Constitution. We have to continue on this road to making Japan more democratic, more peaceful, more sovereign, as it were, more global. We have to kind of shake off the post-war regime. We got to move in that direction. I hope they do. I think it is a matter of time. I'm just really sad that this young man, 67-year-old, he was coming back, by the way. And a lot of people don't realize it. They think he was retired politician. No, he was still on the diet. He was still holding a seat in the parliament. And he was going around giving these talks, like where he was assassinated, partly as a test of his own health, because they were waiting to see if his physical health was strong enough to run again. And apparently it was. So it looked as though he was just on the verge of making another jump for the prime ministership. He didn't, he won't, and he won't be around to see if Japan turns out to be the kind of country that he worked so hard for. He was a true hero. He was a great man. And I'm just very, very sad about this. I do take it kind of personal. As I said, I got to know him.
Well, Professor Kevin Doak, thanks so much for joining today to fill us in about Shinzo Abe.
My pleasure, Eduardo. I really enjoyed talking to you about this very, very important person in a country that I love.
Thanks.
Thank you.